Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is the last part F of lecture 6 on descriptive statistics and Islamic approach. In the previous lecture we compared countries on their performance with respect to reductions in infant mortality. Now in this lecture we consider the question of how such comparisons should be made, in the sense that when we compare some countries with other countries, the countries should be similar so that there is no danger of comparing apples and oranges, they say. So how do we decide when countries are similar, when the groups are comparable or not? This is the question that we will look at in more detail. So it's important to keep in mind that when we make a comparison, it's always with reference to some benchmark. What is that benchmark? This is something that we should learn to be clear about. And then it's important to understand that the benchmark we choose should be fair, should be reasonable, should be similar to the thing you are comparing to. But this similarity is a confusing and complex concept, and it can be used to construct false and misleading benchmarks and comparisons. So basically we will try to discuss in greater detail what similarity means, when it is valid and when it is not valid. Here we look at Pakistan's performance using the methods of last lecture, and that is Pakistan's infant mortality curve matched to the third percentile, which is the 75th percentile, and it follows more or less parallel to that. The top curve is the maximum. So if we look at this picture, we see that Pakistan has followed the global trends in reduction of IM, which all countries have been following. It has been neither done better nor done worse. And in this case, the benchmark is the database of all countries, and that seems reasonably fair. So we can say that Pakistan is not good and not bad in terms of IM performance. But there are many other ways to look at the picture, and we can create a better or worse impression by changing the benchmark. One very simple thing to do is to remove the developed countries, remove the rich countries from the pool. That will automatically improve the ranking of Pakistan. Another way to say it is that, look, Pakistan has made great progress. It went from IM equals 190 to IM equals 60, a reduction of over 300%. So it looks good like that, but here we have hidden the benchmark. What are you comparing this 300% to? You should put in some other countries in the picture. So here the comparison is hidden, and if we compare to other countries, we'll find that this reduction is neither very good nor very bad. So the point is that by changing the criteria and by changing the benchmark, we can always make Pakistan look better or worse. So the question is, when do we know we have a good benchmark, and how do we know when we don't? So intuitively, it makes sense to remove the rich countries, because the rich countries have different characteristics from Pakistan. But suppose somebody argues that we shouldn't put Cuba into the comparison group because it's Latin American. So is that reasonable? What are the factors which which make countries similar, which make them apples and not oranges? This is a very important question, and the discussion on this has been extremely confusing, and it has only recently been clarified and understood due to developments in the study of causality. In this lecture, I'll provide a very simplified and basic explanation of factors for similarity, the factors on which we should match comparable countries. So one of the important conditions is that the factor should be exogenous. It should not be under the control of Pakistan, and it should not be influenced by changes in infant mortality. These are the two variables under study. the Pakistan effect and the infant mortality, and these should not influence the factor. The other condition is that the factor, which is exogenous, should have an effect on the capability of Pakistan to make progress towards the lowering of IM rates. And so basically we can formulate a rule as follows, that if there is a factor, exogenous factor F, which affects the capabilities of Pakistan in terms of what it can do to lower infant mortality, and if Pakistan can do nothing to change this factor, which makes it exogenous, then we should compare Pakistan to countries which are similar to Pakistan with respect to this factor. Stated in this abstract way, the rule is hard to understand, but when we illustrate it with examples, it will become clearer. So first, let's think about exogenous factors. So for example, we can say, let's compare Pakistan only to countries in Asia. These are similar. Well, according to our rule, this is not a valid factor. The Asia is an exogenous factor. Pakistan can do nothing about being inside Asia or outside. It cannot choose to leave Asia. But being in Asia doesn't affect Pakistan's capability to lower the infant mortality. So even though it's exogenous, it's not relevant to the issue we are studying. So we should not take Asian countries to be similar. However, the idea of a rich country being different from Pakistan is valid, at least in the short run, because Pakistan cannot choose to become rich in the short run. And being rich does influence capability to lower IM. You have more resources you can devote. Another possible exogenous factor is the urban-rural divide. How many people live in the cities and how many live in the farms? It's harder to get healthcare to rural areas, so it's matters for lowering infant mortality. And at least in the short run, Pakistan cannot do much to change the urban-rural picture. So it's exogenous and it has an effect. So these are the valid factors for comparison. On the other hand, endogenous factors are not valid for comparison. Suppose, for example, we say that let's match health spending. Let's compare Pakistan with other countries which spent equal amounts on health. That's sort of like cheating, because Pakistan chooses how much to spend on health. If Pakistan wants to lower infant mortality, it should increase its health spending. So to take countries out which are spending more on health is just removing genuine and legitimate competitors to make Pakistan look better. Think about the mechanisms by which Pakistan can lower infant mortality. Pakistan could build more hospitals, it could train more doctors, it could run public campaigns to change social norms, make people more aware of the problem and more seeking of healthcare, more going to hospitals, etc. And that would have a good impact on infant mortality. So these factors one should not condition on. One should not look at countries which spend equal amounts on prenatal care, because these are the mechanisms, these are endogenous, these are things which Pakistan can change. And now if we think about this, then even the urban-rural divide and the rich versus poor, these are valid in the short run, but in the long run, Pakistan can choose to change these also. So in the long run, these may not be validly considered as exogenous. The concept of similarity applies to a much more general class of problems, and in fact the classic example is the medical example, where we have two groups. One group has a disease and we do nothing. That's called the control group. The other group has the disease and we apply some treatment. For example, we give surgery to them. So in that case, then we compare the treatment and the control group in terms of the outcomes. For surgery, it's usual to look at the 3-year survival rate for the outcome. So suppose that In a certain group of patients who have heart disease, the treatment group has 70% survival rate in 3 years and control has only 50%. So superficially it means that surgery works well. It improves the rates of survival by 20%. Is this really true? Well, that depends on whether the treatment group and the control group are comparable. So again, the same concept that we have applied earlier applies here. F is a confounding factor if it is exogenous. It doesn't, it's there before this division into treatment and control, and it is not affected by the surgery. And this factor also affects the probability of survival. If the treatment and control group are similar for all of these confounding factors, then they are comparable, and then this conclusion that the treatment is good would be valid. In real life, there are many such cases in which such comparisons have been made, but they have led to the wrong conclusions. Suppose, for example, that 100 patients have this heart condition, and the doctor chooses 50 of them who are eligible for surgery. These are the treatment group and the rest are the control group. We find that there is substantially higher 3-year survival in treatment group, but there is a reason for this. When the doctors choose patients for surgery, they make sure that there are no complicating factors. They say that, okay, this should be the only problem, and the patient should not be suffering from some other random health problems which will interfere with the surgery. It will also make the surgery appear bad if the patient dies later due to the complication and not due to the surgery. So in fact, what happens is that the doctors end up choosing the healthier patients, the ones who have minimal complications. So the health of the patient before going into surgery is a confounding factor. The treatment group is generally healthier than the control group. So how can we solve this problem? Well, one very simple way is to take the 50 patients that the doctors have chosen and among them choose 25 of them as controls and give 25 to the doctors to operate. So now these patients have been chosen by the doctors, so they are equivalent in terms of this factor. And when we do this in real life, we find that in many important cases, you have equal survival rates among the control and the treatment. So the surgery didn't have an effect. It was actually how the doctor chose the patient. The doctor chose the healthy patients, and the healthy patients all have the same survival rate regardless of whether they have surgery or not. And we find that the patients that the doctors did not choose, they have lower survival rates. So the lower survival rates are not due to not having surgery, they are due to not having good health in the first place. Now, as another example of this phenomena, think about an expensive drug for a disease. Among the patients who take the drug, recovery rate is 80%. Among those patients who do not take the drug, recovery rate is only 50%. So superficially, it looks like the drug is effective. But we have to ask, are the treatment and the control comparable? It may be the case that those who can afford to take the drug are wealthier and have better health. Those who cannot afford are poorer and have worse health. So in this case, again, we are making the wealth is an exogenous factor, and it does have an effect on the outcomes. So because of this, the treatment and control are not comparable, and so either we should compare wealthy with wealthy or poor with poor. This is the wealth is a confounding factor here. A classic example of this occurred when the polio vaccine was first discovered, and it was given large-scale trials in school. So school children were offered this vaccine, and those who accepted to take it were the treatment group, and those who did not accept were the control group. Now here there is a problem that sociologically, it was found that people who are poor are generally suspicious of medical treatments, and they would tend not to accept taking the vaccine, and those who were rich were much more likely to accept. Now, one more twist in this problem is that the poor are more resistant to polio, because polio comes is a disease of hygiene. When there is poor hygiene, then children are exposed to polio and they develop resistance and immunity. But in living in hygienic surroundings, children do not get exposed to polio and therefore they have less immunity. So when the trials were run, the poor showed good results without the vaccine and the rich showed good results because of the vaccine, but the effect of the vaccine appeared to be much less than it really was. So again, there was confounding. The confounding factor is wealth, and this made the vaccine appear less effective than it really was. In the USA, which has the world's largest proportion of people in prison, the word recidivism means that when people are released from prison, then they end up going back to jail for similar crimes sometime later. So there was a program conducted to try to reduce this recidivism, going back. And so what they did was they chose volunteers from the prison for intensive and difficult training. It was a tough workout they were. They compared those people who had gone through the program with the people who had not gone through the program. And they found that the people who had gone through the program had lower recidivism rate. They would not end up with the same percentage. Here again, there is a confounding factor, and the confounding factor is motivation. Only people with high motivation would participate, would volunteer to take this difficult program. Now, if you look at, so the solution is to take all the volunteers and put some of them into the program and some of them into the control group, not into the program. Now, these two groups are matched on motivation, and now when we compare rates, we will find out whether or not the program has any effect or whether it's all due to motivation. So to conclude this lecture, we note that whenever we make comparisons, it's with reference to a benchmark. The treatment group is being compared with the control group. These two groups should be matched on the confounding factors. Confounding factors are the ones which are exogenous and which affect outcomes. If we don't match them, then we can get wrong results from the comparison. At the same time, they should not be matched on endogenous variables. They should not be matched. We should not be matching Pakistan with other countries if they have the same number of hospitals, because that's an endogenous variables. Now, what is endogenous and what is exogenous and what affects outcome depends strongly on our knowledge about the real world. The data does not tell us this. It is something that we know by understanding how the real world works. And so the issues about confounding, which have confused statisticians for a long time, is mainly because statisticians look only at the numbers and they don't look at the real world. And so these numbers don't have the information that is required to solve the problem of confounding. No matter how much data you gather, even big data, you cannot understand what is a confounding factor and what is not without going beyond the data to look at the real world mechanisms which generate the data. So that is the basic task of real statistics.